I want to come back to some of the fundamental questions I wanted to ask. As I see it, in terms of the work of this committee, one of the most important things we can do is contribute to getting on a more sustainable course. How serious a threat do you believe it is to our long-term economic strength to having deficits of 10% of GDP this year and being on a course to a debt that would be 233% of GDP according to CBO if we stay on the current trend line? Dr. Zandi, how big a threat do you see that to our long-term economic security?
It's lethal. I mean, I think if you don't make changes to change those forecasts in a substantive way, our nation's economy will be, and our living standards will be diminished for generations to come. So I think it absolutely, positively has to change.
Well, that's about as clear as it can be. Lethal is pretty strong, and frankly, I agree with it. I believe that. And so then the question becomes a matter of timing. I personally believe, and the commissions, all of the bipartisan commissions have come to roughly the same conclusion. That is, don't make big changes right now, but put in place a plan that makes big changes over this decade. In the case of the Fiscal Commission, we reached a determination we needed to reduce the deficit $4 trillion over that period of time. $4 trillion. That's real money. What do you say with respect to timing and size of the changes that are required?
I think the Fiscal Commission laid out a very good roadmap for you. There was two commissions, and both, roughly came to the same place and laid out roughly the same path. And I think we should move in the direction that they've laid out for us. So the deficit to GDP, let's call it 9–10% this fiscal year. If we can get that down to 2 to 3% of GDP by the end of the decade, and do that in a way that everyone believes we're going to do that, and we don't have to do it in 1 year. We can do it over that period, and we don't have to begin now, and we shouldn't. We should start that process when the economy is moving forward in a clear and definitive way. And my benchmark for that would be a falling unemployment rate. As soon as the unemployment rate is definitively moving south, I think at that point we can conclude that we're off and running, and we need to then refocus and start imposing a real fiscal discipline and austerity. Before that point in time, I think we'll probably make our way through, but it would be, I think, a risk that we should not take. And so therefore in 2011, I think you've done what you need to do. I think we're in good shape. I would not change fiscal policy, the thrust of fiscal policy for calendar year 2011. But beginning in 2012 and through the end of the decade, I think at that point we need to be very, very disciplined with respect to reducing those deficits, get it down to 2% of GDP.
So in dollar terms, what size of package would be required?
So if you meet if the sort of the numbers I gave you earlier, and your bogey is 2.5% of GDP, that's $375 billion a year in today's dollars, right? So to get that down to where you zero, that $375 billion in zero in 5 to 7 years, that's $50 billion a year in today's dollars. Obviously, it's more dollars in the future, but that's roughly what you need to do, and it has to be very clearly done. Yeah.
It has to be credible that it is going to be done.
Credible, and I think there's many elements of credibility. I mean, one is, and again, I'm hearkening back to the Commission.
So we're talking just in terms of dollar terms of the total package. You're very close to the kind of $4 trillion number that the Commission came up with.
Exactly. Right.
Dr. Shepak.
Yeah, the only point I would make is that, let's face it, 95% of our problem is health care costs. We kind of know what to do in Social Security when we get the political will. So I think the structure of the package is also very, very important. I mean, again, you can cut domestic discretionary and get the generated savings there, but I suspect you're not going to get the impact on financial markets if it's a package of domestic discretionary. It seems to me it's got to be health care. And that's a problem, because I don't think we know how to do that, and we've got some more experimentation. But I think it's 90% of that problem is healthcare.
You know, let me just say this. All roads lead to health care, but what the Commission concluded, and I think correctly so, everything's got to be on the table. You got to do revenue. You got to do domestic discretionary spending on both the defense and non-defense side. I'll tell you, testimony before the Commission on some of the things that are happening at Department of Defense was startling in terms of cost. You got to do the entitlements. And obviously, the biggest entitlement, the place where we have the biggest unfunded liability, is in the health care accounts. Now, I know I don't want to reopen the health care debate, but I would say this to my colleagues. I was deeply involved in that effort, however imperfect it is. We took every idea, virtually every idea, for reducing health care expenditure that analysts gave us from whatever perspective. So the best analysts, in fact, Senator Gregg and I wrote a letter to CBO and asked them, what are the things that we could do that would give us the biggest bang for the buck at reducing health care expenditure? CBO came back and told us, number one, you've got to change the tax treatment of health care. And economists from almost every philosophical perspective said that is the case, because you are encouraging overutilization. Number two, they told us, you've got to change the payment methodology. You've got to quit paying for procedures, and you've got to move to paying for health care outcomes. Third, they told us, you've got to put in place some ongoing mechanism to get the ideas that work in terms of bringing down cost, getting them implemented. And so we put in place this whole new institution to try new things, and if they work, to implement them nationally. I'm sorry, did you want to add a point to that?
Well, the only point I'd mention, and this is not a position of the organization, but having spent a fair amount of time on this, I almost think one thing that you ought to look at is because we now have all-payer data systems in a bunch of states, which means we have a much better sense of what's driving the cost of health care. And it has to be done for everybody. One of the things I'm concerned about, if you cut Medicare or Medicaid, it just gets shifted to the ERISA firms and so on. I almost think it's got to be done state by state now. And one thing that may be worth looking at is you provide some incentives to states if, in fact, that they begin to reduce the rate of increase in health care costs for everybody in the state, because I think it's got to be addressed across the board. Some states may want to regulate, others may want to do transparency, but I think it's an approach that may be worth looking at.
All right.